Hey everyone, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to episode 269 of the Property Podcast. This week we've got an awesome episode, and it's awesome because we're joined, sort of, by Ray Dalio, and we're going to be using the knowledge of Ray to ambitiously explain to you exactly how the economic machine works.
Yes, thank you for joining us on the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning, without fail, property investors come together to be informed and inspired. Now, importantly, property investment doesn't happen in a vacuum. You can be a brilliant landlord, a fantastic negotiator, a dab hand at a refurb, but if you don't understand the economic context that we're operating in, you will not ultimately be anywhere near as successful as you should be. Luckily, someone far smarter and richer than us has broken all this down, and we're going to be breaking it down even further and tying it back into property and the UK context. So that's coming up in just a sec.
So it's time for our news story, and it links in really well this week to the main topic. Rob, what have we got?
Well, the headline is, in classic headline form, Prime London Woe. Price falls, slow sales and valuation markdowns. This comes from a report put out by Coutts Bank, who I bank with. No, I don't. They're a private bank for very wealthy people who are obviously very concerned with Prime London. And the point of including this story isn't just to bash London a bit as we have done in the past, but it's because there are some really interesting statistics in here that show just how much Prime London is struggling, which you might not be aware of if you're not actively transacting in this market, which chances are you're not. I'll pick out just a couple. One really striking one is that 53% of Prime London property is being sold below the asking price. Now that's up from 42% last year, which in turn was a big increase on the previous year. So that's over half of property selling below the asking price. The average discount from the asking price is 12.1%. And because property values in London are, of course, so high, a 12% discount is pretty sizable. So if you're able to negotiate the typical discount, that'll get you $155,000 off the average home in Wimbledon, or $600,000, Rob, off an average home in Mayfair.
Wowzers, that's a portfolio in Burnley. That's unbelievable. Huge falls. But they had to, because they just went up so high, it needed adjusting.
Yeah, and the other notable thing is that transaction volumes are way down. So people often say that property prices are sticky downwards, basically meaning no one wants to sell at a loss. And so the fact that prices are falling means you're also seeing fewer transactions. So there's actually a third fewer transactions than there were in 2013. So all the signs are that Prime London is not doing well. The report describes it as bumping along the bottom, which may actually be optimistic. It's possible that this isn't the bottom and there's further to fall. But the relevance here is we're not saying that now is a great time to go out and snap up that property in Mayfair you've had your eye on for all this time, but it's that things do tend to ripple out of Prime London for good or bad. So we're already seeing it, but this is an indication that perhaps wider London and potentially going into the commuter belt will have a bit of a cooling effect as well. Nothing dramatic, but it's always worth keeping a little bit of an eye on what's going on there because it does tend to lead the way. All right, so this week we're talking about how the economic machine works. And we're basing this on a video that we've mentioned a few times in the past. And we're mentioning it again and dedicating a whole episode to it because we consider this to be an absolute must watch. It's on YouTube. You'll find a link to it in the show notes, which this week are at thepropertyhub.net/economic machine. And this is a video by Ray Dalio. He is a hedge fund billionaire. He's had success over decades. Last year, he put out his first book, which was Rob B's Book of the Year. So he knows what he's talking about. And in this video, he's taken all his knowledge and distilled it down into something very simple. It's a really simple look at how the economy works. A really important topic, and one that you never really get sat down and told in this format. So this video is the absolute perfect way of educating yourself on that topic. And when you do watch that video, you'll very quickly see how it applies not only to your property journey, but also to your life in general. Lots of things that seemed a bit random will suddenly start to make a bit more sense. It doesn't unfortunately quite give you a crystal ball and allow you to see what's going to happen economically in the future, but it does give you a much clearer idea of what's happening, why, and what's likely to happen as a result. And it really illustrates, Rob, why we have such faith in the 18-year property cycle.
It does. The two work so closely together, and we'll talk about that further into the show. But to start with, we're going to look at how the economic machine works and break it down for you so you can see its relevance to investing. And next week, the follow-up show to this, we're going to look at the relationship between the economic machine video and the 18-year property cycle. So by the end of this week's and next week's episodes, you should have a great understanding of how the economy works and how it's going to affect you moving forward. And let's start with what makes up the economy.
An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up. And a transaction is a very simple thing. You make transactions all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction.
Okay, so you've got individual actors. That could be individuals, can be businesses, can be banks. All those people buying and selling between each other make a market. That means that there's a market for everything. There's a market for food, for clothing. There's a stock market, which is a market for businesses. And of course, there's a market for property. Now, when you buy something, you make a transaction, whether that's for goods or services or financial assets. You can use one of two things to make that transaction with. You can either use money or you can use credit. And credit's an important idea that we'll be hearing a lot more of as we go along. So that's what makes up a market. And then the economy is just all of these markets combined. So lots of transactions make up a market. Lots of markets together make the economy. So far, so simple.
Now, the biggest buyer and seller is the government. And the government's broken into two parts. So the first part is the central government, who collects taxes and raises money and spends money. So currently that's Theresa May and her Tory buddies. So the second part is the central bank. And the central bank, or in the UK we'd call it the Bank of England, they control the money and the credit in the economy. And the bank does this by lowering or raising interest rates, or printing more money, or implementing QE, which brings us nicely on to credit.
Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the biggest and most volatile part.
So as I said earlier, when you make a transaction, you can either use money for that or you can use credit. Now, there's actually a market for credit as well. Credit is just another type of transaction. So on one side of this market, you've got lenders, and on the other side, you've got borrowers. Lenders are in this market because they have money and they want to turn that money into more money in the form of interest. And borrowers want access to that money because they want to buy something that they don't have the money for right now. So it might be a car, it might be a holiday, it might be a property, might be an investment in their business. It could be any number of things, but the common factor is they want something now that they don't have the money for now. So you've got this market for credit with lenders on one side, borrowers on the other. And just like in any other market, the good in question, which is credit, has a price. And the price in this particular market we call interest rates. So as you can imagine, when interest rates are high, that means that borrowing is expensive. And when interest rates are low, it's cheaper. So as you would expect, that means that more people will borrow when interest rates are low.
So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns, and every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So when you spend more, someone else earns more.
Right, so the more you spend, the more someone else earns, and vice versa. When you earn money, the banks are more comfortable lending money. And when the banks lend more money, it leads to more spending. And more spending leads to more borrowing. This sounds quite a bit like a pattern, or what you could call a cycle.
Okay, so if you're borrowing money now, then you're creating a debt that in the future you'll need to pay back. You're basically pulling future spending into the present. So rather than you're saving up your money now and buying it later, you're buying it now and you're going to have to pay the money back later. So in order to pay that debt back, you're going to need to spend less in the future. So this is a really simplified version of what the cycle is, but that is what it is. And this cycle stretches over years and years. And that brings us on to what Ray calls the short-term debt cycle.
As economic activity increases, we see an expansion, the first phase of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the increase in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instantly out of thin air. When the amount of spending and incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation.
Right, inflation. Now, the central banks don't want too much inflation. So what they do is they raise interest rates. Now, interest rates being raised lowers spending because borrowing becomes a bit more expensive. And remember, everything you spend is what someone else earns. So people earn less, which means they spend less, so the cycle continues. And as spending slows, prices fall. Again, sound familiar? Now, many people will think, oh, interest rates going up then, why ever raise them? But we need interest rates to be raised so we don't go into another massive boom cycle. And you could rightly say, well, look, what a load of good we've done in the past at avoiding those. But by raising interest rates, it does help cool it down and maybe stop some of the booms that have happened in the past becoming even bigger. And it's also important for another reason, because after a boom is finished, or a bubble, and that bubble has popped, and we go back into a recession, we need those interest rates to come down. But if you haven't raised them, you can't bring them down. And if you can't bring them down, then you're in a lot of trouble. So raising interest rates in the second half of the cycle is a good thing. And as long as it's not done too aggressively, shouldn't harm the market. We will still see growth. Now, central banks have never got it quite right, but fortunately they understand this guiding principle enough to stop the world economy collapsing.
When credit is easily available, there's an economic expansion. When credit isn't easily available, there's a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades.
So that's the key point. You've got the short-term debt cycle lasting 8 to 10 years, and round it goes. Now, after one of these cycles has happened, there's going to be more growth than there was after the previous cycle, but you're also going to have more debt around. So we've been talking up till now about the short-term cycle. Now we're talking about the long-term debt cycle. So, because incomes have risen over the previous cycle and growth is higher than in the previous cycle, and because it's human nature to only focus on the here and now, prices continue to rise.
So asset values, or you could say, in our world, property, skyrockets because of this. And more credit is created, allowing for spending, and the asset values shoot through the roof. Because everything's going sky high, people start to feel really wealthy. Remember 2005, 2006? And spending continues. But the debt burden grows over the long term until it can no longer be paid back.
For the United States, Europe, and much of the rest of the world, this happened in 2008. It happened for the same reason it happened in Japan in 1989 and in the United States back in 1929. Now the economy begins deleveraging. In a deleveraging, people cut spending, incomes fall, credit disappears, asset prices drop, banks get squeezed, the stock market crashes, social tensions rise, and the whole thing starts to feed on itself the other way. As incomes fall and debt repayments rise, borrowers get squeezed. No longer credit-worthy, credit dries up, and borrowers can no longer borrow enough money to make their debt repayments. Scrambling to fill this hole, borrowers are forced to sell assets. The rush to sell assets floods the market at the same time as spending falls. This is when the stock market collapses, the real estate market tanks, and banks get into trouble.
So, as you can imagine, all the spending stops, and the economy stops too. But unlike a recession, the interest rates are already rock bottom, so they can't be lowered any further to stimulate the economy. And that's what I referenced a few minutes ago. Now, with the debt burden too high and with interest rates unable to be lowered, something needs to happen. And this can be done in 4 different ways.
And some of these ways will sound pretty familiar, and this is something we've been through in the not too distant past. Now, the first way of getting that debt under control is spending cuts, austerity. That's a word you'll have heard a lot over the last decade. So whereas at other times governments are happy to borrow so they can spend money now and then reap the benefits of it later, that's something that they don't want to be doing at this point. So you get austerity.
The second option is debts are reduced through defaults and restructuring. So defaults basically means not paying your debt back or being unable to pay your debt back. And the restructuring is saying, I'm not going to be able to pay it back, but can we do a deal? And that's what happened in Europe. If you remember back only a few years ago, there was a lot of panic around Greece being unable to pay its debts back. What they did is they restructured this debt, so they were able to do that. But in past cycles, a lot of South American countries have defaulted on their debt, and Russia's defaulted on its debt as well in the past. So while this sounds a bit naughty, it is a method that is used in times of crisis.
Something else that's used, which is never popular, is higher taxes. So the government needs to pull in more money. The only way it can do that is through tax. And because the people who have the most income or the most assets will be paying the most tax anyway and will pay even more when taxes go up, effectively this is redistributing wealth from the haves to the have-nots. This is something that people will argue about endlessly and never be happy with their own particular tax burden. But popular or not, taxes have to go up to deal with this debt burden. And then finally, the fourth thing that can be done is the printing of new money. And this isn't literally cranking up the printing press, but it is the government using a bit of financial wizardry to effectively increase the amount of money sloshing around in the system. You'll have heard a lot about QE, quantitative easing. That's basically what this is, the printing of new money. And we've talked about that on the podcast before. So if you're not up to speed with QE, you can go and use the search box to find the episode where we talk about that. So 4 actions that are taken, and through a combination of these actions, you end up with a deleveraging.
If you take those 4 actions, spending cuts, debt restructured, wealth redistributed, money printed, you can see that 3 of the 4 were applied to the UK after 2008. The one that you could say that probably didn't happen, and most contentiously, is that taxes weren't increased. So we had austerity, we saw Europe restructuring its debt, we saw QE. Most of these happened worldwide as well, but what we didn't see is taxes rise. However, we have started to go through a process of deleveraging. Whether we've done it well enough, time will tell.
Even though a deleveraging is a difficult situation, handling a difficult situation in the best possible way is beautiful. A lot more beautiful than the debt-fueled, unbalanced excesses of the leveraging phase. In a beautiful deleveraging, debts decline relative to income, real economic growth is positive, and inflation isn't a problem. It is achieved by having the right balance. The right balance requires a certain mix of cutting spending, reducing debt, transferring wealth, and printing money so that economic and social stability can be maintained.
The question often gets asked if printing money will increase inflation, but the idea here is to print money only enough to make up for the disappearing credit, which is a really tough balancing act. So now there's more money and less debt. Guess what happens? That's right, borrowers are more creditworthy, meaning banks are more willing to lend again, and yes, spending once again increases, and the economy starts to grow again. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why they call it a cycle.
So, in summary, there are 3 rules of thumb that I'd like you to take away from this. First, don't have debt rise faster than income, because your debt burdens will eventually crush you. Second, don't have income rise faster than productivity, because you'll eventually become uncompetitive. And third, do all that you can to raise your productivity, because in the long run, that's what matters most.
So that's our summary of the economic machine and how it works. And hopefully you found that really useful, but we strongly urge you to go and watch the video to build on the knowledge that we've given you today, because it's absolutely fantastic. Every time we've recommended it, people have come back and said, wow, that was a brilliant watch, thank you. But really, we should be thanking Ray Dalio for putting it together. And I think that one of the reasons Rob and I are such huge fans of Ray Dalio is his generosity with his knowledge. He likes to educate. And, we're huge fans of giving away knowledge and education for free. And he's making what was once ridiculously hard concepts to understand really accessible to all of us, Rob and I included. And to give you an idea of the credibility that Ray has on the world stage, is that Europe was really struggling after 2008, restructuring debts and so on, as we touched on. But they called Ray Dalio in to help guide them. And while they ignored this advice in the short term, they eventually came around to understanding that they needed to go through this beautiful deleveraging. And therefore, the 2008 crash wasn't as bad as it could have been.
Yeah, and what I really like about what Ray has to say about all this is there's nothing political about it at all. He is just trying to give his vision of how things work, which is a really difficult thing to understand. There's so much going on, so many moving parts. Trying to make sense of it is really tough. But what he's done here is strip everything away and just look at the mechanics. Now, everything that happens, everything that we've talked about, you could argue about. So people will argue about how much spending should be cut, about what taxes should be, about whether central banks should be getting involved in the way they do in the first place. But none of that matters. But Ray doesn't get into any of that, and he's right not to, because you can only really start having sensible things to say about those topics if you understand how everything fits together in the first place and why you might be cutting spending or increasing taxes and what you're trying to achieve by bringing that about. So now we've got an understanding of how the economic machine works, and we've talked about 2 different cycles. We've got the long-term debt cycle, and we've also got the short-term debt cycle of 8 to 10 years. But Rob, there's our favourite cycle. We talk about another cycle quite a lot, the 18-year property cycle. And that's something beyond what Ray covers here. But there is a real overlap, and you can see how these 2 concepts fit together.
You can, and it's really easy to see, because you've got this 18-year cycle with a wobble in the middle, and Ray talks about this 8 to 10-year cycle. Well, that works very nicely when you overlap the 2, because those 8 to 10-year cycles are either the big property crash or the wobble in the middle. And the wobble in the middle, in Ray's world, is often a stock market correction or crash. And you can see that when you look back at previous cycles. So next week, we're going to bring the two together. And we're going to look at the 18 years property cycle and do something that has been requested for so many times, is look at the 18-year property cycle, but break it down year by year. Now, fortunately, going back from 08 to where we are today should be quite easy because we all know what's happened, but we'll make sure you understand how it works with the 18-year property cycle. And then Rob and I are going to be brave or foolish, let you decide, and tell you what's going to happen year by year leading up to the next crash. If we get it right, it's going to be a must-listen episode, so make sure you join us for that. But before you wander off, let's just acknowledge this wonderful human being for giving us a 5-star review. And remember, if you're enjoying the podcast, get onto iTunes, drop us a review as well. But thank you to the hundreds and hundreds of people who've left reviews already. And Adam is one of those people. And Adam says, "Hello Rob and Rob, I've been listening to your podcast for a few months now, and I would like to give my sincere thanks as it's an invaluable resource. I'm 22 years old and I'm looking to jump onto the property market soon. At the moment, I'm just setting up my long-term goals. You make the subject of property fun and I look forward to learning from you both. Thanks for everything you do and keep up the good work." Well, thank you, Adam. You keep up the good work and good luck getting on the ladder.
Okay, so your homework for this week is to go and watch the video that we've based this episode on, how the economic machine works. You'll find it on YouTube. If you've watched it before, worth a rewatch. I watched it again this week to prepare for this episode and found it a really useful refresher. So that should be enough to tide you over till Tuesday, when we're going to be back with Ask Rob and Rob. And then next Thursday, the unofficial part 2 to this, where we're talking about the 18-year property cycle year by year. So we'll look forward to seeing you back here very soon. Until then, have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.